Welcome back, listeners, to You're Listening to Radio Revel. This week is a bit of a throwback episode. I've resurrected the Keyhole Witness series to tell the story of an English woman who lived in the late 19th, early 20th century. The story came to me through my fellow podcaster and virtual friend Eric of the Break Fix podcast. He had someone reach out to him with the idea of elaborating a story about the woman who has been credited with sitting for the Rolls-Royce mascot known as the Spirit of Ecstasy. After researching this woman and the men she rubbed elbows with, I came up with this story, a kind of alternative look at the legend, as well as a bit more focused on the woman herself. What I tell, I do not report. I merely tell. Welcome to a new Keyhole Witness episode titled The Spirit of Everywoman. Nellie was lying on the rumpled sheets of the unmade bed, clad only in one silk stocking pulled up over her bent right knee. Her left foot crossed over that knee, and her arms stretched to her toes in a gesture of putting on the other stocking, though that stocking was tangled in the bedclothes to her left. Maybe the next movement was actually lowering the left leg and removing the stocking from the right. Were she to do this, she would be totally nude. Nellie would not reach over for that stocking, though. Her nose itched, but she wouldn't lift her hand to her face to scratch. Charles was a very fussy man, and right now, concentrating deeply on the charcoal sketch he was blending into his notebook. Nellie knew that if she broke this pose for something like an itchy nose, it would break that concentration. He would, as he had in the past, snap at her and scold her as if she were a child. Despite being only 16 years old, literally a child, Nellie didn't like being treated as one. Eleanor, Nellie scolded herself mentally. Your name is Eleanor. Nellie is gone. You left her behind when you left home. The day you came to live here, you were reborn as Eleanor Velasco Thornton, renowned actress and dancer, applauded on the London stage, favored muse of Charles Johnson Sykes, famous sculptor and painter. Eleanor Velasco Thornton, the incarnation of Aphrodite, ecstasy incarnate. Nellie didn't share these thoughts aloud with anyone. She understood that they were childish, knew that she'd be laughed at, and again treated like a child. Many of her fantasies of goddesses and ecstasy came from her own imaginings, her own escapism from her fairly strict, struggling, tradesman-class upbringing. Some of her musings arose from the acting and social etiquette classes she received from her neighbor, Emma. And yet this idle daydreaming, this self-distraction from the boredom of sitting for Charles, would become a line upon which she could peg her hopes and dreams for her future. Nellie's father, Frederick, was a particularly unimaginative man. Educated in engineering, fresh out of school and recently married, he procured a position with the L. Clark Muirhead and Company telegraph interest, a job that had him traveling about England and Scotland to oversee installations and repairs on telegraph lines. When he was not out in the field, he was responsible for local offices and operators. This meant he was most often home in the summer when weather was less likely to take down lines. The closest Fred Thornton came to spending time with his daughter Nellie was during those periods that he was home, when he needed help at a local office. Telegraph operators were not a dime a dozen, and an absence at one office or another meant that Fred would have to substitute. And when there were 2 or more absences, Fred would take Nellie, and later her younger sister Rose, park them in a swivel chair and have them attend to both the incoming and outgoing messages. The girls knew the Morse code as well as they knew the alphabet they used in school. Nellie caught on to the entire messaging thing especially well, as when her father was away, her mother, Sarah Ann, often drafted Nellie into her service. Despite her parents having sent both Nellie and Rose to the subsidized poor girls' school, the Grey Coats Hospital Academy, money was almost always problematic in the Thornton home. Sarah Ann kept a tight rein on the household books, and Fred's salary nearly met their needs, but she had finally taken on jobs herself. Sarah Ann was literate, something many of her neighbors in the terrace-housed neighborhood were not. She could read letters sent by local departments, and more importantly, she could draft letters in reply. She had a Remington typewriter her husband had fixed from junkyard recovery, and she made enough money to comfortably supplement Fred's pay. So, many an afternoon on arriving home from school, Nellie would find a hastily written note on the table asking her to rush over to this or that neighbor's house to take notes or to read correspondence or bring the typewriter there or pick it up to take it to another neighbor's. Nellie became well acquainted with typing, grammar, spelling, and, thanks to the telegraphy work, the concise use of language. She hardly ever said more than was absolutely necessary to get what she wanted, and that talent helped her almost always get what she wanted. What Nellie had most recently wanted was to get out of the Grey Coat Hospital Academy. Nellie walked every morning with her younger sister, Rose, more than an hour through the foggy, damp streets of London from their tired terrace house in the Stockwell neighborhood up to the academy near Westminster Cathedral. Nellie felt stifled, suffocated at Grey Coat. Girls were only allowed to wear those name-forsaken gray coats with those scratchy gray skirts. During the long days at school, they were shuffled from Bible class to cooking class to household cleaning class, back to Bible class, with a nod towards the modern young woman employment possibility of clerical or shop work. Most girls would end up taking a position that would begin with washing up in the scullery, perhaps move up to making beds, and finally graduate to polishing silver, maybe even simply a combination of the three. So most of the education offered at Grey Coat focused on preparing the girls for this. Nellie, though, was quite sure her future would not include white aprons and raw hands. There were also days when there was no note on the table when Rose and Nellie returned home after school. They would often find the house cold and empty. Frederick would have been called up to Scotland to direct the rehanging of wires or the replacement of broken posts. Sarah Ann would most certainly be somewhere else reading a letter that had come in the post this morning with a threatening-looking coat of arms replacing the return address, or perhaps crafting a response to that letter in reasonable language that the neighbor would not have used nor would have known how to write out. An empty, cold house was no problem. Right next door the girls would find Emmeline, whom they called Emma, fussing about in her kitchen with a hot kettle ready on the stove and a bit of bread and jam spread out on the table. Emmeline Velasco was an exotic member of the Stockwell Terrace house community. Despite having a Spanish-sounding surname, Emmeline was Polish. She had come to London with her Ukrainian husband mainly because it was in London that she could find clients for her ever-burgeoning acting/social graces school. While she and her husband Ralph plotted and planned the school they would eventually open in Devon years later, Emmeline gave allocution and poise lessons throughout the year to young artistes recently arrived in London. Emma, who had no children of her own, treated Nellie and Rose as if they were her special pets, her talented daughters. She saw clearly that both had been blessed with physical traits that would be advantageous as they navigated their futures. Nellie was, even in her early teens, a well-built, rounded-out female who would certainly attract the attention of a man of some station, perhaps even a station above the strict terrace house station the girls had been born into. In addition, Nellie was incredibly clever, obsessively organized, and a very quick study. The challenge was to rise out of the caste of the terrace house, perhaps find a path into at least one caste above. Emma focused most of her efforts on molding Nellie into a modern woman. The suffragist movement was not something that could be ignored. Women were marching in the streets. Some were even throwing explosives here and there. Emma was fairly critical of most of the demands placed upon women by those whose main efforts seemed at times violent and always political. Emma saw no reason for a woman to dress like a man or go after a man's job or even behave like a man. Women were women and should be allowed to be so, and take every advantage afforded them as women over the men they would encounter in this modern world. Emma believed firmly that women possessed the wiles and the arms necessary not only to survive, to defend themselves, but also to triumph without counting on any manly traits. These were the ideas she infused into Nellie's open mind. Being clever simply meant that Nellie would be more capable of holding her own when men eventually entered the picture. Right around the time Nellie turned 16, she confided her frustration with the strict atmosphere of the Greycoats Hospital Academy to Emma, complaining that the studies there offered such a narrow outlook on life, all bed-making and shopkeeping. Nellie asked Emma if she mightn't suggest a way out of the school, out of her home where she was basically unpaid labor to her father or her mother, and out with a pathway to a future that fit Nellie. Emma hobnobbed with most of the artists who lived in the bohemian Chelsea neighborhood, in small flats in the ancient Pheasantry, that building that only decades earlier had housed the principal nursery for the exotic pheasants and live-hunted animals shot at by the nobility. She enjoyed the company, especially of the actresses, models, and dancers, 3 professions that women could aspire to without much male obstruction, although the aspiration to these always seemed to be considered secondary to respectful marriage and homemaking. These women were often discriminated by society as not much more than pseudo-prostitutes. Even so, Emma thought Nellie might fit in with that bohemian crowd, or at least get a start among them. Emma first consulted with Sarah Ann, who knew her daughter was headstrong. Obliging her daughter to take that hour-long walk to the Greycoat Academy that only restricted her growth as a person would finally end in an uncontrollable rebellion with a probable unfortunate outcome. Sarah Ann agreed to allow Nellie to take a room at the Pheasantry in Chelsea. Emma had vouched for others who lived in the complex, especially one Charles Robinson Sykes, a young artist, then 27 years old, who was beginning to make a name for himself as a sculptor, who might agree to serving as a type of mentor or guardian to the girl while she got her feet wet. With her looks, Nellie might even take on work as a paid artist's model for Sykes and other artists living there, in this way begin to make a living for herself. So it was that, with her mother's hesitant blessings and her father's near-total ignorance, Nellie, only 16 years old, an age that many girls began looking for positions, quit the Greycoats Hospital Academy, moved out of her parents' home, and began her career as an actress, a dancer, and an artist's model. That last, artist model, that's what placed her on Charles's bed in Charles's apartments at the Pheasantry in Chelsea. A knock on the door broke into Charles's concentration, and he groaned, no, actually growled at the interruption. He shouted a distracted, "What?" in the direction of the closed door, which opened, and one of his mates hesitantly leaned in to tell Charles that Monty and Sis were in the drawing room asking after him. Charles growled again. The mate softly closed the door. Nellie lifted her head slightly to make eye contact with Charles, who cursed and told her that he'd forgotten plans he'd made with some friends. She could get dressed. They were done for the day. Nellie was glad of that. She finally reached up and rubbed under her nostrils with energy before she rescued her stocking from the sheets, pulled it on, then wrapped herself in the dressing gown she'd worn to the sitting. As she passed through the drawing room, she saw a couple standing next to the fireplace who somehow seemed out of place in these apartments, like nobility descending into the world of the proles for a disagreeable, fleeting moment. The man noticed Nellie, but rapidly looked away. The woman made a more careful assessment, but also turned away when Charles came in from the bedroom and greeted them. Nellie slipped out the main door of the apartment and climbed the stairs to her own room that she shared with 2 other girls in the attic. The shillings and pennies the unknown struggling painters and sculptors at the Pheasantry were able to pay Nellie were far from what she needed to pay for that shared room. No matter how elegant her stage name, Eleanor Velasco Thornton, sounded, she'd only been called upon once as a stand-in for a tableau, forced to wear a scratchy woolen overcoat that smelled of grease paint and sweat, to pose without moving for 20 minutes while the comics and singers who had the lights brought laughter and applause from the audience. And Eleanor Velasco Thornton had only played at dancing with her younger sister. She had no moves and less rhythm. So, despite all her mother's lessons in home economy, if there were no earnings, there was nothing there to budget with, and Eleanor was near ruin. Nellie whined about this to her mother one Monday evening as the two women did the washing up after a rare family dinner. Nellie's father was smoking a pipe in the back courtyard outside the kitchen door, and her mother reached over the basin to push the window shut, both to block the smoke and to keep their mother-daughter conversation private. Fred had not been approving of his oldest daughter's move into the pheasantry, which he considered the den of inequity in London. Sarah Ann began clanking the stoneware plates in the water to make a distracting sound from the words she meant only for her daughter to hear. "See here, Nellie, I know how important it was for you to get out on your own. I know you thought you weren't going anywhere at Greycoat. Now, having one less tuition to pay has been a bit of a relief on expenses around here, but not enough that your father and I can support you in your current lifestyle, and especially not the lifestyle of an actress or a dancer." No! Sarah Ann held up a wet, soapy finger to Nellie's objection. "Your father is way too conscious for your excuses, so there's no use you asking me or him for any money. You need to take advantage of what you do have. Emma Velasco was not wrong in teaching you how a woman should navigate a man's world, but the whole acting artistic path is evidently not working. You're a bright girl. You know how to manage numbers. You're articulate. You know how to read and write. You've been concise with your telegraph work for years. You're almost obsessively organized. There isn't a straw in your head. You're all brains. Being cute certainly helps. It might get the door open, though it will probably open the wrong doors. Most cute women end up naked in beds, and not so that some man can project them into posterity. Look over on the cupboard there. I've left you a few pages from the Times. There's ads in there, dozens of ads looking for young women able to do the same things you can do. Write letters, organize papers, use the typewriting machine. These are salaried jobs. You'll make money doing them. Without money, you know, you won't get anywhere." And Nellie knew that Sarah Ann was right. It was unlikely Eleanor Velasco Thornton would ever actually support herself as a member of that clan of bohemians who were likewise nearly unable to support themselves. If Eleanor was to move forward, it would be in the serious world where her natural, almost inherited practicality of thought would be her best advantage. Eleanor had drive, and was smart enough to know when the road her drive was taking her down was probably not the one that would most directly take her to her desired destination. Nellie, or perhaps now that it's been nearly a year since she's moved away from home, we should call her Eleanor, was sitting for Charles again. Though she wasn't really sitting, she was standing in his bathroom, leaning over the large tub towards a huge oval-shaped mirror hanging on the tiled wall. This time Charles had draped a long bolt of gauze over her shoulders, suggesting some type of a mythological bathing gown, something to partially discover the immodesty of a nymph at a pond in the forest. And uncharacteristically, as he sketched, he chatted with her, asking her how her search for a day job had been going. Eleanor explained, while trying to keep as still as possible in the somewhat uncomfortable lean, that she'd been rising nearly every morning, buying the Times, clipping an advertisement, getting dressed in her only formal dress and hat and shoes, interviewing for a position, or simply leaving a typewritten note in different offices about the city. She was not especially enthusiastic today. The insurance office, the scrivener's shop, the hat manufacturers, all had been polite, but none had sent word of employment. Charles quipped "That's too bad," and kept on sketching. Once he'd finished up and told Eleanor that she could dress, Charles suddenly remembered something that he'd forgotten, again not uncommon in his character. He told Eleanor that he had a friend who had just recently become a founding member of what would be some kind of automobile club in the city, and that the gentleman who was named secretary of this club, one Claude Goodman Johnson, was looking around for some clerical help to get the offices of the club up and running. Charles asked Eleanor if she'd be interested, and she replied that automobiles couldn't be any more mundane than insurance or women's hats, could even be something exciting. They were new and somewhat controversial. Charles scribbled out a note of introduction in his sketchbook and handed her the leaf, and Eleanor planned to visit the offices the next day. Eleanor was not Claude Johnson's first choice for Girl Friday. She seemed fairly young and had an air of frivolity that could just be perceived under an otherwise serious demeanor. She was also really attractive, something that could be problematic to his personal life. Claude was still flirting about with a childhood sweetheart, looking towards marriage, much to the chagrin of his parents who felt that they had educated him better. Jessica, the girl in question, was a rather controlling and jealous fiancée who would certainly have some sharp words to say about the hiring of a cute, well-developed adolescent as a secretary. Yet a certain stroke of fate intervened on Eleanor's behalf. The very day that Eleanor presented herself for the position, as she sat at a table and demonstrated that she could indeed manage a typewriting machine, Claude had a visit from one of the founding members of the Automobile Club, the esteemed John Montague, Member of Parliament, son of the First Lord Montague Douglas Scott of Beaulieu. John, or Monty to his friends, had dropped in on club business and to steal Claude away for an afternoon drive in his Daimler automobile. Looking over at that young woman clacking away on that infernal writing machine, Monty had the strange intuition that he'd seen her somewhere before. Without making any connections, he turned to Claude and made a comment on how a good-looking secretary certainly brightened up a drab office space. Eleanor worked for Claude from 1897 until 1902. In those years, she proved herself to be an organized, intelligent woman with an uncanny talent for event logistics. Her work on the club-sponsored famous 1,000-mile trials in the spring of 1900 was hardly applauded enough. From heading off local protests against motor cars, still considered by rural folk as a nuisance at the least and a real danger to body and property at most, to simply making sure there was petrol available along the route, as well as reserving hotels, restaurants, and catering services, Eleanor naturally and effortlessly shined. Like any event planner, the better the job done, the more invisible they become. The 1,000-mile trials was a massive success for the Automobile Club of Great Britain and Ireland, and so Eleanor went almost totally unnoticed. But not totally. Soon-to-be Second Lord Montague of Beaulieu, that is, Monty, who had, as a founding member of the Automobile Club, had an active role in the planning of the trials, who participated with moderate success in the race, well, he had noticed Eleanor and her tireless efforts to pull off this logistical challenge. Monty noticed how she always allowed the men at the planning meetings to think they'd originated an idea to do this or that, when it had been she who had imagined the detail. She always managed all the testosterone in the room with one or two carefully worded sentences. He noticed how she made her simple beauty into an effective tool for getting what she wanted from the men. He had also made the connection during a visit to the club offices with Sykes, who warmly greeted Eleanor, that he'd seen her so scantily clothed in Sykes' apartments about a year ago, an image he could and would superimpose on the serious professional look she presented in the Automobile Club offices. Monty could certainly give the impression of a man of means, a member of the wealthy class who moves through life's challenges with the confidence that a fat bank balance and secret business connections afford. But at the time he was motoring about in his Daimler, impressing the other rich men in his motoring circle, he was actually living off his father's estate. Having been voted a member of Parliament just a few years earlier at least ensured that he could brandish his own reputation, and he had plenty of influential friends, but the truth be known, and it was kind of known, just around 1902, Monty found himself pretty much broke. It was then when one of his friends, the newspaperman Alfred Harmsworth, offered him an opportunity to make a living within the strict class expectations of his caste. Harmsworth was a sort of silent party all across the upper-class ecosystem. Publisher of several very popular newspapers, beginning with the Daily Mail in 1896 and later the Daily Mirror in 1902, his journalism was renowned for its simple language and straightforward reporting of stories that were of interest to the plebe. Harmsworth had been instrumental in making sure the 1,000-mile trials were a success, not only by providing popular, positive coverage in his press, not even by participating himself with his motor car, but by putting up much of the money needed to pay for the event at a time that the auto club was in the red. When Monty let slip, in an unguarded moment of soul-bearing, fueled by tobacco and brandy, that he was tight for capital to continue his auto hobbies, Harmsworth suggested creating a magazine. Glossy magazines were not something new. There were magazines that covered all kinds of interests, from ladies' fashion to politics. However, up to the date, no one had thought to create and publish a glossy magazine about automobiles. The idea was golden. The entire reason the Automobile Club of Great Britain and Ireland existed in the first place was to promote the automobile in the kingdom. What better way to do so than an illustrated rag with the latest news and information to convince a hesitant population to jump onto the automobilist chassis? Of course, as the man who would establish the advertising-driven business model for the printed press, Harmsworth was also thinking about the money he could make advertising cars and car-related stuff. Monty went about the business of starting up his foray into publishing in the same way he did everything. He turned to the people he knew. First, he spoke with Claude. The Automobile Club was now fairly firmly established, was making some money, had caught the eye of the Crown Prince, who Monty himself had encouraged into the burgeoning auto fever. After 5 solid years of making the club a solid foundation for both the industry and the political world, Claude had decided to move on, having partnered with one Charles Stuart Rolls, an ambitious young man everyone called C.S., who had a special flair for sales. Claude and C.S. were to set up the first car dealerships in the realm, and let's face it, Claude would make a whole lot more money than the always struggling auto club was able to pay him. The physical offices of the club were moving. Everything seemed to be ripe for change. The most Claude could promise Monty was to place automobile ads in his new magazine. As Monty left Claude's office, he stopped to chat with Eleanor, who was sitting at the very table he had seen her at 5 years earlier. Despite her hard work, her efficiency, her capacity for solving problems even before they became problems, Claude hadn't even promoted her to her own office. She had become much more than a simple secretary, and yet here she was, typewriting machine to one side of her desk and papers to the other. Thinking it was an appropriate moment, Monty offered Eleanor a position at his magazine with a higher wage and her own space to do her logistical magic. Eleanor looked around at all the boxes prepared for the move of the office to Piccadilly, realized that change was indeed in the air, and accepted the job. No one really knows when Eleanor and Monty started their affair. It at least had to have started soon after Eleanor's taking the job at Car Illustrated. In 1903, Eleanor found herself pregnant and giving birth to her only child, a girl, Joan, who she held briefly after the delivery, then immediately gave into adoption. Monty could not possibly recognize the child publicly. He was happily married to Lady Cecil Victoria Constance Kerr Douglas Scott Montague. He was a member of Parliament. At some point he'd become the second Lord Montague of Beaulieu. Eleanor could not become a single mother. That would simply cast her into infamy. She would lose her hard-earned status, her job, her connections, albeit superficial, with the rich and powerful men her lover rubbed elbows with. So Joan was given over to the Iresons, a lovely couple who became friends with Monty and his wife, Lady Cis. Lady Cis was a woman who was always the even-headed one in any room, the wife who knew her husband varnished his walking stick elsewhere but helped him keep it discreet. Cis would make sure that Monty took good care of his responsibilities to Joan, even if they were to be kept secret. Eleanor would later consider the decision to give up her child to have been the hardest she'd had to make in her life, but there it was, done and over. She had chosen both her affair with the married man and her career as his attaché over the harsh realities of single motherhood in early 20th century England. Monty, for his part, was entirely smitten by Eleanor. Though he loved his wife, had loved her almost his entire life, they had known one another since they were children. No surprise, Monty and Cis were first cousins after all. He was like so many privileged men of his time, the manly bravado, the expectations of virility, a certain disdain for women in general. It was almost expected of him that he would have an affair or two. He was a nobleman. He'd become a nobleman on his father's death in 1905, moving so from Parliament into the House of Lords. Now, you'll recall that Claude Johnson had partnered up with a C.S. Rolls to open automobile salons and sell the machines to well-to-do Englishmen. Well, right around the time that Monty was packing up his papers and moving them from one governmental office into another, both Claude and C.S. had met an automobile engineer by the name of Frederick Henry Royce. His cars were well made, had a touch of the luxurious, and Claude and C.S. saw how they could focus exclusively on Royce's designs and stability to create an exclusive car fit for the exclusive buyer. The Rolls-Royce became a thing, and Claude became the company's first boss. Monty, now a lord, got caught up in the whole exclusivity idea. He'd been placing ads in his magazine for all kinds of automobiles, with prices ranging from the affordable to prohibitive, and the new Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost represented the peak of prohibitive. Consequently, the Lord John Walter Edward Montague Douglas Scott, yes, Monty, had to have one. He was not the only rich man who had one, but he was one of the first. Now, the Rolls-Royce car was so exclusive for many reasons. For example, they were designed with the latest and best concepts of automotive engineering available. Each car was highly personalized, nearly artistically created according to the personal tastes and suggestions of the man purchasing the vehicle. Every detail was planned, consulted, executed with the idea of creating the, quote, best car in the world, a car that a king would drive. One detail, though, was not necessarily considered, or perhaps was considered too bespoken, and that was the car's mascot. The mascot was actually a fancy schmancy radiator cap. You could buy a Rolls-Royce with a traditional, though shiny, stainless steel screw-on cap to cover that access to the radiator, but that would hardly be all that exclusive, would it? Monty certainly didn't think so. He asked his friend Charles Sykes if he couldn't make a design of something that could be stuck on that boring cap, kind of like the figurehead of a ship, something that would symbolize the grace, the beauty, the stealth of the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. Sykes had been illustrating for Monty's magazine, Car Illustrated, for years now, had painted portraits of the Rolls-Royce, had actually drawn an entire series of Rolls-Royces driving up to different places, the theater, the horse races, the country home. Sykes liked the idea of making some kind of statuette for his friend, and his playful side had him pulling a box of old sketchbooks off a high shelf in his studio and looking for drawings of one special model he'd drawn years earlier, special because she had been his muse for a couple of years, special because she was quite stunning in the sketches, special because she was Monty's lover, Eleanor. Sykes made a couple of drawings from his sketches. He settled on one that presented a young version of Eleanor, leaning slightly forward, a gauzy bathing garment like one worn by a nymph at a hidden forest pond billowing behind her. This nymph held a finger to her lips, Sykes' hint to Monty that the lovers' affair would always be kept secret between the two friends. Monty was delighted with the little brown statuette Sykes cast for him, bolted it onto every Silver Ghost automobile he used for years. Sykes called the statuette the Whisperer. Now, Monty was not the only man who wanted a figurehead bolted onto their fancy radiator cap on their exclusive Rolls-Royce automobile. As the manufacturer was so dedicated to respond to each and every whim of the purchaser, other artists and sculptors were producing personalized mascots, from comical police figures to downright nearly pornographic representations of human copulation. That young automobile engineer, Henry Royce, was somewhat scandalized by the idea of a figurehead being bolted under the hood of his cars at all, but there was little he could do to prevent the habit. Men will be men, and will want their symbols right up front where everyone can see them. Royce asked Claude Johnson if anything shouldn't be done to protect the prestige of the Rolls-Royce mark. Claude had a quick and historic insight. He'd of course seen Monty's personalized mascot, the Whisperer. Claude had liked it, found it dignified of the Rolls-Royce, though he found Monty's dedicated poem to the statue a little silly. I am the little silver fairy, your mascot of many a mile, bringing you golden hours, guiding you safely the while. Anyway, Claude consulted with Sykes, asked him if he mightn't rework the design he'd done for Monty, make it a more mature, stylized version of the Whisperer to serve as the official mascot for the Rolls-Royce. Something that would look good in silver, something like that statue in the Louvre, what was it called? Winged Victory, but with head and arms, please. And maybe a bit of discretion was needed. It might not be a good idea to keep the face of the Lord's secret lover on a mascot that would represent the best of the best in automotive. Well, you get the message. Sykes loved the idea and got right down to work. He resketched the statue, simplified the gauze, and shaped it more like wings, pushed the arms back into that billowing cape, and, considering it the most correct, reworked the face to represent perhaps the only other woman in his life he would consider his muse, his mother. The evolution was evident. Eleanor was only a base for the end design. She had been diluted out of the statuette. Rumors ran rampant among those who knew. Those rumors became urban legend, and yet, truth be known, that mascot that started out as the Spirit of Speed and then became known as the Spirit of Ecstasy was a conglomeration of charcoal sketches of Eleanor's early sittings as a model, a marble statue in the Louvre, and the artist's own mother. None of this actually mattered to Eleanor, or anyone else for that matter. She was comfortably installed in a pleasant apartment near Hanover Square, could take a coach to work every day, wore the nicest of frocks and jackets and shoes and hats that a professional woman could want. She was excellent in her job managing the offices of the magazine, and as time passed she became indispensable to Monty as his responsibilities in the House of Lords became more complex. Especially as the war was becoming an unpleasant reality even in London, Eleanor was becoming more a trusted Lord's attaché than a publisher's executive secretary. Round about 1915, Monty, Lord Montague of Beaulieu, was commissioned to travel to India to manage something to do with motor cars for the British Armed Forces there. He proposed to Eleanor that she accompany him, if not all the way to India, well, at least to Egypt. To those who would observe, the trip would simply be a lord on official business traveling with his secretary. To those who knew, including Monty's wife, who continued to nod and then turn her head, it would be an opportunity for the two to be alone and not have to play act, at least not on the cruise across the Mediterranean. Eleanor wasn't all that keen to travel so far. She had become an avid reader of the press, the Times with her breakfast at home, the Daily Mail with coffee at the office, the Daily Mirror at tea in her parlor. She was horrified at any news from the front, frustrated with the stupidity of politicians and generals and noblemen and businessmen who caused and pushed this silly war forward. She understood the cultural, social, even economic realities that surrounded the events, but couldn't find justification for the massacre of so many young men. And she was deathly afraid of those deadly U-boats. The Germans had developed a kind of boat, an underwater tank, a sausage made of iron and armed with torpedoes, a vessel that could not be seen, that could sneak up on a boat and sink it in less time than a call for help might be heard, speeding away under the waves to attack another boat. The Mediterranean Sea was just beginning to see more and more of these U-boats. Eleanor did not fancy being on a ship that had been targeted. Yet the promise of a cruise with her lover, a relaxed honeymoon-like voyage across the Mediterranean away from gossip and restrictions, well, Eleanor was a woman in love as well. She agreed to travel with Monty at least to Egypt, then return to London to continue to manage business at Car Illustrated. On Christmas Day, 1915, Monty and Eleanor boarded the SS Persia and rapidly settled into the routines of sea travel. Discreet separate rooms and first-class accommodations, the relaxed spirit of the voyage, a calm sea, the first 5 days almost convinced Eleanor to change her plans and accompany Monty all the way to Bombay. It was on the 30th of December, as the couple were settling down to lunch, that a German U-boat torpedoed the SS Persia. The torpedo blasted into the steam boilers, one of which exploded on its own. As the ship began to sink, Monty and Eleanor rushed to Monty's cabin to retrieve the newfangled inflatable life jackets he received as a gift, rushed back to the deck. The SS Persia was tilting, water was rushing about as well. Both Monty and Eleanor ended up in the cold Mediterranean Sea. Monty lost grip on his lover. Eleanor was gone. Monty was picked up 3 days later, clinging to the underside of an upturned lifeboat with other survivors. Nellie's father and mother would not see her die. They would both die before her. Her sister Rose married a guy named Gordon. When Eleanor died, Charles Sykes got in touch with Rose and gave her the original mold he'd used to cast the Whisperer for Monty as a memento of her sister. Once Rose died, Gordon remarried. Funny anecdote. Someone broke into Gordon's home once he'd remarried, and among the things stolen was that cast. Funny thing to steal. Around 1910, Eleanor had stopped frequenting the pheasantry, concentrating on her professional career, and so lost touch with Emma Velasco, the allocution teacher. Emma and Ralph finally moved to Devon and opened their acting school. Emma Velasco passed away not long after the war was over. C.S. Rolls, the car salesman, got a bit of air fever, traveled about in hot air balloons, then became the first private person to buy an airplane, one of the first people to fly with Wilbur Wright as a passenger in a biplane, the first pilot to make a non-stop return trip over the English Channel. He did not stop there with being the first, though. C.S. Rolls was the first fatality in British aviation, falling from the sky nose first when the boom of his biplane separated from the chassis. His funeral procession was almost a state event, in crowd size at least. Alfred Harmsworth, the newspaper publisher, survived Eleanor by 7 years, passing away in 1922 from a prolonged illness, at first rumored to be syphilis, probably because of his reputation as a ladies' man, later confirmed as a chronic blood infection he'd harbored for years. Claude Johnson, the first CEO of Rolls-Royce, died just 11 years after Eleanor. He'd been poorly for a while, insisted on attending a niece's wedding, collapsed, was rushed back to London, and finally succumbed to pneumonia only days later in 1926. John Walter Edward Douglas Scott Montague, 2nd Baron Montague of Beaulieu, known to friends as Monty, would live another 14 years after losing his lover. His death at 63 in 1929, like Claude from pneumonia, would leave a single heir, Edward, at the time only 2 years old, fruit of his second wife, Lady Cis having passed away in 1866. Monty would remember Eleanor with a dedicated plaque hung in the Beaulieu Abbey, reading, "In memory of Eleanor Velasco Thornton, who served him devotedly for 15 years. Frederick Henry Royce, the automobile engineer, was never a very social person, so that when in 1930 his health began to deteriorate, it was not considered odd that he work from home and be cared for there. Despite this quiet home and work situation, Royce passed away in 1933, asking specifically to only be remembered, not to be heralded. His wishes were respected. Charles Sykes, the man who sculptured the mascot of an elegant woman with a gauzy cape leaning into the destiny ahead, would survive Eleanor another 35 years. For many of those years, he would personally cast and polish each and every Spirit of Ecstasy mascot ordered to embellish the radiator cap of a Rolls-Royce automobile. A quick afterword. Contemporary information about Nellie Thornton, more popularly known as Eleanor Velasco Thornton, is so sparse and mostly anchored to the men she worked with and around. It is also conditioned by the necessity of keeping her relationship with Lord Montague secret, conditioned by social mores and expectations, conditioned by attitudes, prejudices, envies, and gossip that would have made her life a hell had she not been discreet and clever as she evidently was. In other words, there's really not much about her. There is little or no indication in her time of her having been a particularly active member of any feminist or suffragist movement. Her climb in the professional world seems only too likely to have come from a combination of evident factors. She was indeed good-looking, she was clever, she had a particular background and upbringing that gave her the practical skills she could use within the limited opportunities offered a woman in the working world of the late 19th, early 20th century in a heavily classist society. She had family and friends who supported her and encouraged her throughout her initial years. She had contacts as well that obviously made her entrance into the work world easier. She does seem to have been a self-made woman, but she was also the servant of two masters. The chauvinistic male-oriented world of Edwardian England, open to her only through the men she kept company with, and her own ambitions to rise out of the social position of the terrace house neighborhood of her youth, perhaps at least inhabit the neighborhood of the class one step above her. Movement between classes in Great Britain wasn't something that happened frequently. And allow me to address the elephant in the room. The story of her being the inspiration for the Rolls-Royce mascot may very well be true, though I didn't find reliable contemporary evidence of such. Just the same circumstantial detail I've used to tell this slightly more mundane story of the woman and her connection with the statuette. I personally think the general acceptation of the story of Eleanor being the model of the Spirit of Ecstasy is more a product of urban legend, supposedly confirmed years after the actual events, combined with romantic marketing. I'm not suggesting that she was not. I'm merely telling the story that I saw as I delved into what little information we have about her from her contemporaries. Eleanor was definitely a remarkable woman, one who probably died too young. She was only 35 years old. Had she lived, the track record she had until her death would no doubt lead us to expect that she would have accomplished much more, might even have lifted herself out of anonymity and into a respectable place in history that represented more substantially who she was, what she had done, than the superficial story of posing for a luxury car mascot. Eleanor was one of hundreds, no, thousands of women struggling in a world that continued to consider them second class for having been born girls. Her legacy should be her personal success in life. That's what I will remember of her, now that I've told this version of her story. A beautiful, talented, clever woman, able to put men in their places, able to tell men what to do and get them to do it, able to climb a professional ladder, and all that without the men around her taking notice. Hats off to Nellie, Eleanor Velasco Thornton, artist model, secretary, executive secretary, attaché to a lord, the spirit of the successful 20th century Everywoman. Cheers, Eleanor.
You're listening to Radio Rebel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.